Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another section of Music 1300. My name is, of course, Professor George. We are in our final lecture of the semester, which is so exciting. I feel like I have saved some of the best topics for last. Our musical arts unit is about investigating how music interacts with different mediums. And I think one of the overlooked mediums that is particularly important now, especially because we are all homebound, but even before this point, is the medium of video games. And truth be told, video game scores, even the primitive ones that I was listening to when I was a teenager, really influenced me as a musician, and actually why I even took on composition in the first place. I have yet to actually score a video game. I would love to in the future. I've definitely done works for theater and cinema, but video game music is something that I have yet to embark upon. Not out of my wheelhouse, but there are some certain parameters that one has to kind of consider within the medium of the video game. And one of the bigger themes that we're going to be talking about today, that is something that I've talked about throughout the semester, is the idea that the medium impacts the message. That whatever you are working with or working for is ultimately going to have a huge impact on the final product that is created. The medium impacting the message. So sometimes I like to think about this in regards to just the visual medium, first and foremost. The idea that, like, if you were an artist and you were given a particular kind of medium, something to work with, like watercolor, for example, that you might approach creating a painting or a picture or whatever you're going to create with watercolor. Whatever image you're going to create is going to be influenced by the fact that you are working with watercolor. For example, I might be more inclined to do something that doesn't require hard lines, that is a little bit more impressionistic, for example, or a little bit more color oriented. If I were, the idea of like colors transitioning into other colors, if I were working with watercolor, versus acrylics or oil paints are going to lend themselves to a different kind of expression. And the medium of the video game is a little bit different than the medium of music for film or music for the stage. The big difference here, at least when we're talking about current video games, and this has changed a little bit based on the technology that video games use. The idea that the gameplay, at least for most current video games, is one in which the composer is not always certain how the sound is going to interact with the image, and that's a new and novel thing that doesn't exist in works for film or works for the stage. The composer is very aware of how the music is going to be timed with the image exactly. This is not to say that there weren't composers that were experimenting with this idea of what we call indeterminacy, or flexible scores or flexible notation, where the format and function of the piece is going to change based on some elements that are decided in real time. Stockhausen has a number of pieces that work with this as like a parameter. So does John Cage, another composer that we've talked about and read a bit of his writings. Dealt with kind of formats that you would see in current video game scores, where there's a kind of like a choose your own adventure element to it, or these atmospheres that are sort of put forth and evolve based on a number of different decisions, whether or not they're decided ahead of time or during the performance, is kind of at the whim of the composer. But these kinds of things existed, of course, outside of video game music in the art music realm, but that just like didn't kind of catch on nearly as much as it has in regards to video games. So couple of things that we're going to definitely hear that are very similar is the idea of leitmotivic development. That's a part of operas, certainly, and also cinema. That's going to play a huge role in the sort of epic narratives that we'll encounter in video games, like the Final Fantasy series, for example, or even Zelda. The first thing that I want you to do before I continue rambling on is to make sure that you've got your one page. Your one page here is says press start to begin. It has a timeline that we're going to follow to talk a little bit about how video game music has changed. And we're going to stop along the way and talk about some key systems and some key composers and particular games that have come out that have really changed the direction of where video game music has gone. The first point that I was trying to make is that the medium impacts the message. So early video game music was really limited to a number of different factors. Just to start us off, just so we have a basic idea, the first video game system that is like released for home entertainment is released in 1972. That's probably not like the most well-known system, that the Magnavox. It was released, but it wasn't really like the I would say like probably the most popular early video game system. The idea of like handheld, like electronic entertainment became really, really popular with an unfortunate game that Milton Bradley came out with called Simon Says a couple years later in 1974. Since you guys are all on the younger side, you might not know what Simon Says even was. So I'm going to pull up some early footage of a Simon Says, so you can, rather than me explain it to you, you can actually just get a very immediate visual. It's not like a video game in terms of like it has a cartridge or a disc and you like insert it, but like it's definitely electronic handheld gameplay. Let me go and toggle over to footage of that. All right, here is a Simon Says. The idea is that you're repeating this same pattern that the Simon Says is repeating. It gets longer and more intricate, obviously. That's what happens when you get something wrong on Simon Says. Very good. So early handheld entertainment, not especially sophisticated, but fun and somewhat musical as well. The next big thing that happened and that was released was in 1975, and that was a game called Gunfight. The big thing with that was that it was, as you might imagine, like involved a gun, but there was a sound effect, which was a gunshot. This was new and definitely didn't exist with Magnavox. That was the first system that was released in 72. Big thing happens in 1977. The Atari is released, and it is released for the holiday season. It is huge. Why? It comes with 9 different cartridges and 9 different games that you can play with it, all that have some very basic sound qualities to them, elevated from the idea of just having like a gunshot sound effect. But let me show you some of what the early Atari was like. So here's a commercial that came out in December for the holiday season that was marketing the Atari?
Attention shoppers, the new Atari cartridge game is in.
Excuse me.
Uh-oh, George again.
Ooh, Atari's ASCII battle.
It comes with 27 games, but that's just for starters. You can get 9 cartridges, 187 games.
Blackjack. Oh!
I'd like an Atari.
Sorry, only our demonstrators left.
Mine!
No, George. Mine.
The new video computer system by Atari. More games, more fun.
There we go. So it gives you a little bit of a look into what the early gaming system was. Again, some very primitive sounds, but definitely a step up from the like single shot gun sound effect that was a part of Gunfight that was released in 1975. Another big name comes up a year later, 1978, Space Invaders. Space Invaders isn't so much like a soundtrack or a score, but one of the things that's really important here is the idea that we have like a rhythm and like a pacing that helps escalate the heart rate of the person playing the game. So the idea is that as trouble is ensuing, the beat pattern of what we're listening to, the soundtrack, accelerates. This is a technique that's replicated in a number of different games that are released after Space Invaders. But let's take a quick look at what Space Invaders looked like. Okay, this is what Space Invaders looked like. It was, again, a step up from some of the elements that Atari had. But let's just watch some gameplay so that we can see what the sound design is like. Like a kind of plodding, pacing sound, which is gradually starting to increase in tempo, accelerate. The ostinato is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So a lot of early video game sound design made use of ostinatos, getting musical ideas in order to, well, in this case, heighten the experience for the player and to sort of accelerate their heart rate and kind of make it seem like impending danger and doom is on the scene. Very okay, so hopefully you guys get the idea. Awesome. All right, so that was a little bit of Space Invaders. The next big thing, we have something that happens obviously between, plenty of things that happened between 1978 and 1980. Probably the big thing is Asteroids, which is released in '79. I'm not gonna show you guys footage of this one, but again, like took a page from Space Invaders, essentially. Same kinds of ideas here because Space Invaders was hugely successful as an arcade game. Space Invaders, while it is probably still in a weird way hugely popular, the cult classic that probably will stick around for a while that came out a couple years afterwards is PacMan. PacMan has again, similar elements here, the idea of using rhythm to engage a player and sort of accelerate their heartbeat and make it feel like there is impending doom of some sort. But there's also the idea of like a World 1 and World 2 that happens in PacMan music, where the music here plays a particularly important role in letting you know when like effects, for example, will end, and they help reinforce what's happening with the image. Let me pull up some footage of PacMan, should you guys not be familiar with it. Hold on. All right, here's some footage of PacMan release 1980, the original arcade format. Let's check out some gameplay so we can see what's happening with the sound design. Very good. So, very similar things that are happening here in PacMan, but a kind of elevated element here where we have like Sound World 1 and Sound World 2 that we are listening to, and where music plays an important role in gameplay and kind of letting us know how long these intervals last, because musically they are the same amount of time. In any event, PacMan, hugely popular in 1980. In 1981, Atari releases the next version of their system. It's still 8-bit sound, but the big thing here, we have continued to like have elevated gameplay and increase in graphic capabilities just by a little bit. Donkey Kong is released in this year. Let me show you some early footage of what Donkey Kong looked like in 1981. Okay, here's some early footage of Donkey Kong that you would have played in an arcade in 1981. That's a classic cue from like black and white films, the early 1920s, 30s. So again, we have this thing that we picked up from PacMan, where we have like immunity statuses or special effects that have a time limit to them that are we are assisted with a cue. Also, a death cue now. Come back to our introduction music and the ostinato again. Again, the special effects. It always lasts a specific length of time, so we can actually see our musical career fairly okay. We use music to know when run out in a video game, for example. I'd like to get to the part gameplay music starts our next level. So there's a formula to it, most certainly, but we are sort of elevating the number of musical cues, certainly from PacMan here. Still taking a page from that classic, but continuing to sort of build upon some successes that were used in the scoring there. We're going to look at one more segment before I stop part one of this. And that is, we're going to, in 1983, the first really good use of the laser disc came about. The laser disc, maybe you guys remember, was often used as a educational tool, but there was a video game that was released on Laserdisc, and that was Into the Dragon's Lair, and that was in 1983. Because it was on disc, you had a big jump. I'm going to use that sort of term loosely in terms of the visual content. Let me pull up some footage. All right, here's some footage of Dragon's Lair when it came out in 1983. It was such a big to-do, so different than the other arcade games that there were a number of news reports that were released about it. Check this out. It includes some of the footage of the gameplay as you would have experienced it.
For the first time, we've put the hands of the engineers who have heretofore been the game designers. They've designed all the games we see in the arcades. Now we're taking Hollywood and the screenwriters and the people that work with dramatics, and we're putting them hand in hand so that engineers and dramatists, if you will now work on what will be in the arcade market. And that's why I think you'll find something that is tremendously more exciting, something that will pull you into the screen like you haven't been pulled before.
These kids at the Celebrity Sports Center here in Denver are playing the newest rage in arcade games, Dragon's Lair. You've seen how different this game looks from the average video game. The reason is the players are actually playing a movie. Options are presented to the player on screen, and it's up to the player to react correctly. The scenario changes depending on the reactions and decisions the player makes. Make the wrong decision, and our hero, Dirk, meets an untimely end. It was invented in part by former Walt Disney animator Don Bluth, who has struck out on his own and in the last few years has been responsible for the animation in the motion picture Xanadu, and for the artistic and critically acclaimed Secret of Nim.
First of all, you have to give the illusion that the game player is in control, when indeed he may not be. But you must give that illusion. I thought, wow, that's right up our alley. That's movie making. Give the illusion, present a moment to him in which he must react, a moment of danger, and then get him to react to that moment at the right moment. Then you'll see another scene in which he is saved from that. I thought, well, that's very interesting. How can I design a game which will present enough of those moments in short little periods of time to where the game becomes exciting and gets him keyed up? And that was the challenge of designing the game.
Dragon's Lair is as different from normal video games as Space Invaders was to pinball. There's absolutely no comparison. The task of putting the game together was awesome. 13 animators sketched 50,000 drawings of the characters in action. 24 drawings for each second on screen. The drawings were then transferred onto clear plastic sheets called cells and painted. Intricate, detailed backgrounds were drawn and painted as well. Special effects like raging fire, crumbling walls, and deadly vapor were added to signal immediate danger to the player. The cells were combined, and then each drawing was sent to the camera department for photographing, one frame at a time. 1,440 frames for each minute of finished product. Dialogue, sound effects, and a musical score were added to enhance the feeling of playing a movie instead of a game. Finally, the entire film was transferred to a high-resolution laserdisc for use in the game itself. An incredibly complicated process. An incredible game.
Awesome. So, huge departure that happens. It was so different than everything else. Like, obviously, this has a quality of like an early computer game, you know, and people obviously reacted really positively to this. The other thing is, because we were pressing something to Laserdisc, and the idea of having like a cinematic approach to the score, very different also than what was happening with PacMan and Space Invaders. You also had more space. You weren't confined to the 8-bit or what would become 16-bit or 32-bit or 64-bit technology, and the sound profiles that were around with that kind of technology. So we're gonna start part 2 talking about Nintendo. Nintendo erupts on the scene in 1985, and what they do and some of the particular products that they put out are going to revolutionize what happens with video games scoring. So hopefully you enjoyed part 1, and I will see you guys back for part 2.